Thank you. It's nice to be here. Before we talk to Gunnar and Lars, we'd just like to take a few moments to talk about the history of the Nobel Prize, to make sure that we know what the Nobel Prize actually is. Fundamentally, I'm just waiting for, there we go, and there. So, Alfred Nobel and the Nobel Prize. The fundament of the Nobel Prize is one specific document that was signed more than 100 years ago now, in 1895. There we go. Alfred Nobel's last will and testament. This is the basis for the Nobel Prize. This is a guiding document that set out everything he had to say about the Nobel Prizes. This is the start. But before the Nobel Prize started, before Alfred Nobel wrote his will, Alfred Nobel was, in essence, an exchange student. The young man Alfred was born here in Stockholm in 1833, so 108 years ago now, roughly. And his childhood here in Sweden was a poor and a simple one. His father was an inventor, at times fairly successful, but at the time of Alfred's birth, very unsuccessful. He files for bankruptcy, leaves the family. Alfred is raised by his mother and two elder brothers. But fortunately, things turn around. His father moves first to Finland, to Turku, and on to St. Petersburg, and sets up weapon productions. Alfred Nobel is moved with his family there, and is raised in St. Petersburg in comparable wealth. Now he has private tutors, a large home, and the young Alfred Nobel has a very clear image of what he wants to be when he grows up. Alfred Nobel wants to be a poet. A poet and an author. He's fluent in Swedish, in Russian, in French, in German, and English. Decent Italian. However, his father says no. His father says, no son of mine is to be a poet, study chemistry instead. So he sends out Alfred into the world to study chemistry at the great laboratories, mostly in Paris and in Germany. In retrospect, we are grateful that he doesn't actually become a poet. I've read his poetry. It is universally very, very bad. On the other hand, this is a part of him, and it's what, in all likelihood, leads to the eventual Nobel Prize in Literature. But chemistry was what he turned out to be actually talented in. He studies together with the inventor of nitroglycerin, Sobredo, in Paris, in the laboratory of chemist Pelouse. And there he learns how to manufacture it. Well, back in Sweden, he and his family become the first commercial producer of nitroglycerin. But as it turns out, this is far too dangerous. There are many accidents, explosions in laboratories and factories. In the mid-1860s, the newspapers write about the big Nobel blast in Stockholm. At least 8 fatalities, including Alfred's youngest brother, Emil, who's 21. The answer becomes what Nobel, prior to the Nobel Prize, is most known for: dynamite. The fundamentals are fairly simple. The idea that Nobel has is to simply mix nitroglycerin with some sort of absorbent, some sort of powder, basically. After that initial idea, it's really a matter of trial and error. Dangerous, though, with nitroglycerin, of course. So he tries sawdust, gypsum, rye flour at one point, until he eventually finds a mineral, well, that works. The diatomaceous earth that he finds in Germany. The end result becomes dynamite. He names it from Greek. It's dynamis, force. That becomes the brand name of dynamite. And it is on dynamite that Alfred Nobel starts making his first fortunes. He moves from Sweden to France in the early 1870s. Sweden has become, in a sense, too small, too insular. He feels that Paris is sort of the center of European civilization. He writes of Paris that even the dogs are civilized here. I would not necessarily agree. But it is from Paris that he runs his empire. The Nobel Companies establishes factories all over the world. Europe, yes, but also overseas. East Coast North America, West Coast North America, Australia, South Africa, Japan. The Nobel Companies become, in a sense, the first global multinational trust to exist. There are a few things that really make this possible. Part, of course, it's Alfred Nobel himself, his business sense, his entrepreneurship. But it's also a matter of evolving infrastructure. Railroads means that transport is easier, but it also means that there's a high demand for explosives. In this map from Nobel's office, we can see the overlying shipping routes that now spring into existence in the mid-late 19th century and the Second Industrial Revolution. Alfred Nobel is perfectly poised to take advantage of this burgeoning industry. Needless to say, Alfred Nobel becomes very, very rich. Unfortunately for Alfred Nobel, he doesn't particularly enjoy this. He's sitting in Paris rather depressed. Outwardly, he's a socialite, but we can see from his letters that he distrusts his lawyers, he distrusts his business partners. He has no great staff around him, so days are spent with correspondence. He estimates he spends a few hours each day just answering letters. He writes to his brother that, "I firmly believe that a Swede's visit to Paris is not complete unless they ask me for money." So all in all, Alfred Nobel is fairly miserable in Paris. The big mystery, this is in my view, is why he continues. By the 1880s, he's certainly wealthy enough to retire should he want to. But he continues. It's more business development, it's more industrial development. He invents ballistite, smoked as gunpowder, gelignite, a new type of variety of dynamite. And he continues with product development, even though he could, in theory, just retire. In the early 1890s, he moves to Italy, to San Remo. He considered going back to Sweden, but he decided simply, it's too dark and cold. He buys a summer house in Sweden, but spends the rest of his time in Italy. And it's here that the ideas of the Nobel Prize start. Because now he realizes he is immensely wealthy and he has no heirs. He needs to decide what to do with his funds. He has no children of his own, but he does have nephews and niece, but he rejects the idea of leaving the business to them. He writes that the inheritance it makes you lazy. He uses a Swedish term called försoffning, encouchments, sort of, as of being more and more in a sofa. That is what inheritance does to you, he feels. So he needs to do something else with his money. So he decides to give it away. From the early 1890s, these ideas start to come into play. The Peace Prize is first. He says he wants to do something for peace. One of his close confidants is a peace activist, Baroness Bertha von Suttner. Sciences come into play as well, literature. He starts to forming his ideas of this prize that he wants to start. He is not alone in this. There is a movement in this period that if you are a wealthy industrial, you ought to give back. You ought to give something back to society. Carnegie in the US is perhaps the most important example of this movement at the same time. So we start sketching as well. First, a bit of money to the nephews, a bit of money to the niece, friends and family. All in all, around 4 or 5% of Nobel's net worth goes to friends and family. To put this into context, this is enough to make them multimillionaires by present standards. But not multi-billionaires as Nobel himself. And thus comes the important phrase in the will: the rest of my remaining realizable assets, sell everything, invest it in safe securities, and use the interest to award an annual prize to those who have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. In physics, in chemistry, in physiology or medicine, in literature, and in peace. Make it international, he writes. The worthiest shall receive the prize, whether or not he be Scandinavian. A side note, in the second draft of the will, he also specifically states that the Nobel Prize is to be gender neutral. We have no reason to suspect that he changed his mind fundamentally, but in the second draft of the will, he actually wrote it specifically. The final phrases of his will are slightly morbid. They are outlines to his physicians. He wants to make really, really sure that he's deceased. He wants physicians to verify that he's dead, open his veins, and then cremate him. Being buried alive was a common fear around this time. He dies December 10th, 1896 of a stroke in his home in Italy. He's buried in Stockholm. The will is opened, and then it starts. Nobel has decided who is to award the prizes. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Karolinska Institute of Medicine, the Swedish Academy, and a committee appointed by the Norwegian Storting for the Peace Prize. More on this in a moment, when we have representatives from these institutions. But suffice to say, these institutions were crucial in the early Nobel Prizes because Nobel never specified how this was to work. He specified more or less, let there be prizes. And everything after that came from the executors of the will and representatives from the awarding institutions to shape the budding Nobel Foundation and the starting Nobel Prize. It was awarded the first time in 1901 and is still today awarded annually in Stockholm, December 10th. And in Oslo. Sorry. And now we'd like to talk a bit to Lars Bergström and Gunnar von Heine, who are members of the Royal Academy of Sciences and have served on the Physics and Chemistry Committee. Please. So first question. Yes, please. We'll hear a bit about the selection process now from Lars and Gunnar. But my first question is, next week will be the Nobel Prize in Physics on Tuesday and the Nobel Prize in Chemistry on Wednesday announcements. Who will get them?
That's hope it's turned on. Yes. Yeah, okay. So that's a very good question. My guess is as good as yours. No, I happen to know, but it's strictly secret. Not only until Tuesday in our case, but how the procedure in detail has been going on will be secret for another 50 years. So I will never be able to tell anybody of you sort of how this works, but. We can talk to each other and have fun about it and so on, but we will not say anything about to you. And I think that's very crucial that there's a secret really procedure, because otherwise there would be all kinds of pressures and leaks and so on in the newspapers. And I think in particular in physics, and I think also in chemistry, we have been happy to have very, very few leaks. So I don't remember even when we had one in physics. So I guess it's the same in chemistry, Gunnar.
Yeah, it's quite amazing actually, because up until, let's say, late summer in a given year, the only people who have an idea of who the recipients will be is the committee itself. So that's around 7, 8, 9 people, something like that. But as of early September, the so-called sections for chemistry or physics or economics, and if you talk about the economics prize, within the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences become informed and can discuss the proposed prize. So that already expands the number of people to probably for each prize, probably on the order of 20 to 30 people or something like that. And there are no leaks,
So
generally speaking. And then finally, as of a week before the announcement or something, in principle, anybody who is a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences can ask to see what the proposed prize is. So then we're talking, not that everybody does, but in principle we're talking a few hundred people now.
So we have utmost secrecy, but stepping back for a few moments, what can you tell me about the actual process? For starters, we've said that the Royal Academy of Sciences decides, but who specifically does the preparatory work? How does this work?
Yeah, I can say a few words and then maybe Lars can fill in, because you have some slides, I think. I'm just changing position here because I don't like the projector coming into my face. So we have a committee for each prize. And as I said, somewhere around 7, 8, 9 people. 5 of which are kind of really elected members, and then there are a couple of people that are, seconded to the committee. So in the bylaws it says that there should be 5 people in each committee, but we can add some extra ones. So the committee, actually, it's the most fun and most interesting committee I've ever been in, because everybody is totally devoted. Everybody comes at every meeting, and we have lots of meetings, essentially once a month around the year. We have full-day meetings in the committee, and we have a couple of 2-day sessions as well during the year. And I've never experienced a single meeting, and I've been on this committee now, I think this is my 17th year or something. I've never experienced a single meeting where a single person has been absent from these meetings. Only once, and that is because the guy who was head of the committee, that was one of my first years, dropped down dead the night before in a restaurant. And so he couldn't make it, obviously. But that's the only time in those 70 years that somebody has not come to the meeting. So it's an extremely nice and interesting and fun. You might think it's very serious work. We all sit there and are super serious, but in fact, it wouldn't work if we were. So it's really a fun time when we come to these meetings, and we sit for quite a number of years, so we get to know each other really well. But maybe you can say a bit more about sort of the formalities, how it works, right?
Yes, I try to. Actually, since we can speak about things that happened more than 50 years ago, I would take the opportunity to do that. And the committee can also recommend that there would be no prize a given year. That rarely happens, but actually it did happen. I think it was late 60s or early 70s when probably late 60s when the committee recommended there would be no prize. But then at the final meeting of the whole academy, other people, another section actually, the technical section had prepared a proposal. They said this is ridiculous. You cannot let this year go without a prize. So we propose, and then they mentioned the inventors of the transistor. So they got the prize, and this was a fantastic prize, of course. So, but it also shows that although we try to do our best in the committee and find the best proposal and so on, there is a more than theoretical chance, because it happened in this case, that somebody or a group of people in the academy can work out a proposal, put that on the floor the day that the prize should be announced, and they may change the sort of proposal. So actually that might also be a reason why there are no leaks, because you cannot really be completely sure about the final outcome. So actually the press conference is only about 20 or 30 minutes after the decision, which is really remarkable. I mean, it's really and you will be able to follow the press conference, and you should be aware that this is very, very close to the actual decision. Yeah.
We can add,
and I just want to add, in this interim, these 30 to 60 minutes between the decision and the press conference, that's when the famous phone calls are made. So there is only this very short time window when we can try to get hold of the people who've been awarded the prize. So it doesn't always work. We don't always manage to reach the laureates. So they find out because journalists start hunting them or whatever.
We can add also, in addition to the transistor, that this is a strong tradition dating back, for physics at least, until 1901. Because in the very first year, the committee proposed a shared prize in physics to Röntgen for the X-rays and Lenard for the cathode rays. And then when they put it to the vote, the Academy said no, just Röntgen. So he is memorialized as the first sole Nobel laureate in physics. Lenard did get it eventually, but he had to wait a few more years. But to look at these committees, we know that you are on the committees. Who is on the committee? What type of people? Is it only Swedes? It is foreign members?
So formally, it need not be Swedes. It can be really any expert. But in practice, it has almost always been Swedes. I think there are very few exceptions, actually. And I have, here's a picture of the committee a few years ago, in 2010. So you see me up right. And then there is the guy beside me is Björn Jonsson. He's a nuclear physicist. Then we have Börje Johansson. He's a condensed matter theorist. Lars Brink is a mathematical physicist. Per Delsing is an experimental condensed matter physicist. And then in the front row, we have Olga Botner, who is a astroparticle physicist working with the Ice Cube telescope at the South Pole. And then there's Ingemar Lundström, who is an expert on biological physics, and Anne Lullier, who is a laser physicist. Anne Lullier is actually was born French, but she's a Swedish citizen since many years. So I think this would be sort of a typical cross-section. You have people from all kinds of specialties within physics, and we always try to see that we have nowadays 1 or 2 women at least. In the old days, it wasn't like that, as you know. So gender balance has not been a strong point, certainly not for physics. A little bit better for chemistry, but we have really much to do there. Yeah.
Gunnar, is it the same in the chemistry committee in terms of this spread of people?
Yeah, yes, obviously. So the committees, the people on the committee try to represent all the major fields of chemistry, spanning from organic chemistry, physical chemistry, theoretical chemistry, analytical chemistry, through biochemistry. So that's basically what it is. And it's the same principle that it's almost always people who work in Sweden and are Swedish, not necessarily Swedish citizens, but at least who worked in Sweden for a long time.
I guess that's the practical thing. If you have meetings and everyone needs to attend, it's
Yeah,
hard to travel to Stockholm.
That's one aspect, but there are a couple of other aspects as well that I think are important. And one is that I think it's important that we can carry out our discussions in Swedish, in our mother tongue. Because sometimes, it's very fine, subtle things we discuss, and it's important, I think, that we can do it in Swedish. And also, if we're might be a little worried that if there were people who are, say, German or French or English or American or Japanese or whatever on the committee, that they would become under great pressure in their home countries to try to push for the science of that country. So there are some good reasons, we think. Having said that, we do get a lot of input from international scientists. So a very important part of the work is to ask leading scientists around the world for their views on specific topics, on specific potential prize areas and potential laureates. So we commission reports, many reports per year, from scientists around the world, which of course are kept completely confidential. So we don't tell who we ask, and these people are not supposed to tell anybody that they're doing this for us. And of course, whatever they write, the written reports remain classified for 50 years, as we heard.
So we're going backwards now from we have the decision and we have the external reports, but where does this start? What is the beginning of the process?
Yes, so that's a very important aspect of the prize, is that it's only by nominations. If somebody has not been nominated, then he or she cannot get a prize. And let's see, here you see who can nominate. So it's the Royal Academy members, previous Nobel laureates, Nordic physics professors, so all professors of physics in our case, or chemistry.
This should go for physics then, of course.
Yeah,
chemistry.
The chemistry is similar. Yeah. So that's very special. That the Scandinavia and Finland, all professors are asked every year. Then there are physics professors at selected universities. And it's said in the bylaws that I think it should be 6 universities or something like that. But in practice, nowadays it's hundreds. So we really send out lots and lots of requests for nominations. And there are some people we want to hear from that are not at universities. So that's a person on a special list, non-university persons. And of course, the members of the Nobel Committee themselves may nominate. And a very important point that some people don't understand, we get piles of email every year, is that self-nominations are not allowed. They are just disregarded.
So basically, it's not enough to be a genius. Someone else has to think that you're a genius.
Yeah, and also, by the way, it doesn't even help then if you're a genius if it doesn't fit into the description of the prizes. And for physics, it said it has to be for an invention or a discovery. So you may know really brilliant, geniuses, but if they haven't made an invention or made a big discovery, they are ruled out. They are not valid for nomination. And that, I think, we have to really specify that very, very clearly when we write and asking for nominations, that they have to be aware that the prize is very special. There are very special requirements.
Gunnar, chemistry is slightly different in that aspect.
Yeah, so it's interesting wording in the Alfred Nobel's will for chemistry. It says discovery or improvement, not invention but improvement. And so we always scratch our heads and ask, what does it mean? What it does open up for is methods development. So it's sometimes hard to call a new method a discovery, but we can certainly call it an improvement upon pre-existing methods, right?
I'm thinking perhaps Gerhard Ertel would be such a case, who worked with sort of describing methods very carefully, but not discovering them.
Yeah. So you often see many chemistry prizes are for developments in methodology. I could, coming back to your original question, when does the work start?
Oh, yeah.
And so you could, in a way, you could say, well, the work starts when the nominations are in, which is February 1st. But in reality, in fact, the work goes on continuously and for many years. And so there isn't really a clear break from the point of view of the committee that, okay, now we start, a new circle. We discuss these potential prizes that, might become a prize in 5 years or even 10 years. We might be discussing already now. So it's continuous. We discuss these things all the time. And from the point of view of the committee, I guess the mark is when we make our decision every year. Once we made our decision, we basically put that to the side and start thinking about next year's prize. So, for us, this year's prize is already history. I have a hard time even remembering what it's going to be. But
looking at the nominations, I'm guessing these are thousands of people that are eligible to nominate. But how many nominations do you actually receive that are not crazy people nominating themselves? Real nominations.
So actually very few crazy people get to nominate because they are usually not professors at the universities, etc. Right? Of course, if it happens, well, who knows? So usually it's about, it's a little bit different between different fields, but for physics it's about 400 or 500 that we get. And so that's what the selection committee then has to really start sorting out and see what kind of reports do we have on these, in our case, discoveries or inventions. And maybe it's something completely new, and then we have to initiate other new reports, of course. And there are some kind of amusing cases in physics that show that you actually don't really need to be a genius to get the Nobel Prize. I hope I'm not quoted on this one because these happen to be bright people, but I think the key or the best example of that is the two people at Bell Labs who wanted to make contact with a satellite. I think it was Early Bird, it was what's called. And so they directed their antenna to this satellite, but they took the sort of wrong direction, so it was outside the view of the satellite, but still they got some strange signal. And then they, swept around and they couldn't get rid of that signal. So they went even up to this big horn antenna and swept because some pigeons had left something there, and and then of course some people at the neighboring lab at Princeton realized, oh, this could be this famous glow of the early universe, so the light from the birth of the universe, which is of course what it was. So they got the Nobel Prize, although they didn't know what they had discovered. But that's, it's according to the rules that a discovery, whoever makes it, and if it is verified to be valid, then that's eligible to get a prize. So so for all of us, if we're just lucky and do some clumsy things, maybe it turns out to be the best thing we've done.
I guess that the important thing in that also was that when they realized they misplaced, they just didn't ignore it, but that they continued to persevere, to study further. Another person might have just said, oops, we missed, let's aim it back to the satellite. But instead to find something unexpected and continue. That's the perhaps creative step. So once you get a few hundred nominations, and what then? Which are the hardest parts in this?
In a way, the hardest part, to kind of see what are the main breakthroughs in the past years that we should be looking into. That is not so difficult, and I think no matter what the composition of the committee would be, given the nominations and given the sort of general knowledge of physics or chemistry, I think most committees would come up with a similar list of potential breakthroughs that could lead to a Nobel Prize. Usually the most difficult thing in the committee work, I think, is to actually identify and decide on which laureates to include as to represent a certain breakthrough or prize, right?
I'm guessing you can have 10 people nominated for essentially the same discovery.
Yeah. So that's where it becomes really tricky sometimes, and one really has, the committee spend a lot of time looking at it from different angles and thinking, how to weigh this against that and so on to finally make a decision. Because, as you know, 3 is the maximum number for any given prize. 3 people. So, if there's 10, it could be a difficult thing to single out the 3.
And even worse in physics, because last year we had 1,000 people on the LIGO experiment, but the committee managed to single out the 3 people that were the most important, without whom this would never have happened. But maybe it eventually will be impossible, right? So if they will find a new particle at CERN, for instance, it's 6,000 people that will claim, I found it. So actually that might be a problem, because the way physics is done is changing with time. So maybe, and there is a possibility to give to organizations, but that has to be decided by the academy, and so far the academy has decided not to do that, but it is actually possible. So we'll see. But so far it's right. It's just 3 possible.
To expand on that, for the Nobel Prize as a whole, we can state that the Nobel Peace Prize, they have decided to award to organizations, and do so rather often. United Nations, Médecins Sans Frontières, many others. And the Karolinska Institute Nobel Assembly have decided not to award to organizations formally. And the Swedish Academy of Sciences have still not decided in one way or another, but are free to, as you say, do so should they so want. So when it comes to actually voting, sort of when do you come down in numbers? I mean, you begin with a few hundred, but I'm guessing you didn't have a few hundred a month ago.
So I think this differs a little bit between the committees, but in chemistry, the committee itself is basically clear about what prize and which laureates it will recommend sort of in June sometime. And then we spend the summer writing a big report to the academy, and then we present this proposal to the section for chemistry in September. But by and large, we have decided within the committee in June.
Is it the same in physics?
More or less. The details I will not really go into, but there's another interesting thing, that in the will, of course, Alfred Nobel wrote that the greatest benefit to humankind and so on, but for physics, this should be the discovery or invention during the last year. And of course, that would be absolutely impossible, because it usually takes many years to verify a discovery and so on. So that was changed in the bylaws, so we don't have to follow that. But still, it should have a great actuality. So it should have sort of increased actuality the year it is given. And I think a prime example of this is the prize to Professor Higgs and Angler, because they made the discoveries and the proposal of the Higgs particle 40 years before they got the prize. So that is clearly against the Alfred Nobel will, but in accordance with the changed bylaws that I think are very reasonable, and in particular in that case also, because this was really a fantastic discovery.
There are a few, come to think of, that have been the year after. Insulin springs to mind, though in medicine. LIGO, I think, for gravitational waves is year after. Probably a few others, but in general, there will be a time lag between actual discovery and award, which means, of course, we said we don't have to be a genius. we have to work, but we also have to, and this is hard.
You
we have to be alive.
You live long enough.
You have to be alive, and
stay alive.
And since you mentioned Engler and Higgs, I could guess perhaps that Brut would have shared that prize, another physicist, had he been alive a little bit longer. So eat your vegetables.
So another example of that is, this microwave background that was discovered by these people by chance was, of course, later studied in great detail. And there were really a trio where David Wilkinson was one, but he unfortunately died of cancer, the year before they got the prize. But he actually got his name on a famous satellite, so in some sense he was rewarded posthumously. But the Nobel Prize can never be given posthumously after, I think it was a change in the bylaws in the 60s.
73.
Yeah, okay.
74.
Except there was actually one case a few years ago in medicine, the prize in medicine and physiology, where it turned out, so the prize was announced, and the same day it turned out that one of the persons included in the prize had died the night before, or the day before. But the committee had not, didn't know about it. And so then there was a flurry of sort of legal discussions, whether it would still be possible to award the prize and so on. And in the end, the Nobel Foundation decided that it was all right to award the prize to this person. And actually his widow came and picked it up at the ceremony in December.
There is one only exception now to receive a prize posthumously, and it's if you pass away, say in November. Yeah. The important part is, of course, the vote. But then there had been a case when someone died a few days later, and then the prize can be awarded. So once that vote happens, can it be changed in any way, or is that sort of a final decision?
As far as I know, it's a final decision. Once the vote has been taken in the academy, that's it.
So there is no appeal. There is no I don't want it. There is
no. It's very strict actually. One cannot even make notes how the vote went if there was a vote, because it's sealed and finished after that vote. Yeah.
And those votes will happen next week now.
Yeah.
Yes, but of course there are cases where people have denied to receive the prize. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, in literature. So he said, I don't want it. And he never came to pick it up, I think. He did want, later on he changed his mind, right?
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost. We finally got some sources for that. There have been stories that Sartre sort of changed his mind and said, maybe I could get the money. But we looked closely into the archives, and it seems it wasn't Sartre himself, but it was one of his relatives that claimed to represent him, saying we would like the money. But when Sartre himself heard about this, he said, no, I really still don't want it.
And in fact, to get the money, you have to come to Stockholm and give a lecture. That's clearly stated in the bylaws that you have to come here.
But of course, we had one famous case who didn't come to Stockholm, and he didn't lecture about the topic of the prize, and that was Albert Einstein, because he refused to come to Stockholm. He came to Göteborg, and he was lecturing about the theory of relativity, because that's what everybody wanted to hear. Nobody wanted to hear about the photoelectric effect and so on. But I think in retrospect now, the photoelectric effect is, of course, in some sense much more important, because that's the theory behind solar cells and so on. So, of course, Einstein is a very special person. He made, I think, 4 or 5 discoveries that each would, qualify for a Nobel Prize. But they were very, sparse with giving multiple prizes in those days. So.
I would perhaps say there's still spare today, but it has occurred, has it not, in both of your fields?
Yes, so there are a few people who have received 2 Nobel Prizes. And you can see on the Nobel Museum homepage or the nobelprize.org, they are specially listed, those people that have received multiple prizes. And also there are some families that have received father and son and so on, mother and daughter actually, that have received prizes like that.
I think in the record holder there must be the Curie family with, if memory serves me, 5 medals within the family, which is unbeaten, but with a fairly large margin, I would say. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes. We have a microphone. Sorry.
Thank you. I've always been curious why there hasn't been a Nobel Prize for mathematics.
You can probably comment on that.
It's one of the more common questions that we get at the Nobel Museum, and it's an interesting one, but in a sense it's sort of slightly from the wrong direction, because we might as well ask why we don't have a prize in music or architecture or art. We have literature, so art perhaps. The simple reason why is because Alfred Nobel didn't say so. That's the easy answer. Why he didn't say so is rather a question of, as far as we can tell, he chose prizes for what he personally liked. He liked physics, he liked chemistry, he was obsessed by his health, failed poet and so forth. And he was never a mathematician in that sense. So that's the general perspective that he picked from that perspective.
But I have kind of a counter question to you. I mean, Alfred Nobel didn't like economics at all, but there's a prize in economics. Can you explain that?
I can, if we have another hour. It is of course correct, Lars. There is,
and it's actually no Nobel Prize. So
it
that's a story. It was much later.
It was the edition in 1968 of what is the mouthful, the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, which was instituted 50 years ago now exactly, at the behest of the Central Bank of Sweden, after consultation with the Royal Academy of Sciences, the Nobel Foundation and the Nobel family. After that decision was made, it was decided by the Nobel Foundation not to institute other similar prizes. It was taken as a policy decision. But
too bad for mathematics.
Too bad for mathematics. But we should say to mathematicians, it's not too late. It's too late for that, but we have mathematicians receive economics prizes. I could argue that some physicists are borderline, depending on how you sort your fields. So mathematicians can get Nobel Prizes, not just in mathematics.
And of course mathematicians have the Abel Prize in Norway and other prizes also.
The Fields Medal, if nothing else. Yeah. Any other questions? I have a question then. When do you solicit nominations sort of all year round, or is it a set period when they're open? They closed February 1st, we heard, but do you receive them all year around?
Well, of course, everybody knows that if it comes later than 1st of February, then they are not eligible for that year. But what we do is we save them to next year. There's also always a handful, right? But not very many, I would say. So it really starts, in September and all. So right now, lots of nominations are coming in, and of course it gets even more hectic very close to deadline, because the nominators are human, as we all are, right?
So everyone saves it to the last possible moment. So you will call them next week, inform them. What happens then? Do you attend the festivities? The party?
Yeah, I guess we do, yeah.
Well, I don't this year, because I was asked to go to the Norwegian ceremony, which will be nice after 15 years of our, very nice party. But after 15 years, you would like to go to Oslo.
I think in theory you could go to same if you take a quick airplane, but probably not. Yes.
I was thinking, that sometimes people, like in the general public, think that also Alfred made the prize because he invented the dynamite, and that was making a lot of also bad in the world. Did he ever say something about this?
Yeah, he said a few things about sort of his origins. First of all, we can say that dynamite as such was basically a civilian tool. It was more or less not used for military purposes, although some terrorist activities, especially in Ireland, used dynamite. On the other hand, he did build cannons as well. So he did build lots and lots of guns. Ballistite was a huge military development. He said a few things about it. First of all, he felt that he was helping. There is a letter that he writes in the early 1890s to a friend where he comments that he says, I think that in the long run, my cannons will do more good than your peace conferences for peace. The day two armies can annihilate each other, all nations will disband their troops. I would argue perhaps that he was wrong. But those were at least his beliefs. He felt that he was actually doing something good for peace. He also was of the firm belief within sort of history of science and technology, we talk sometimes about a term called technological determinism, the idea that technology moves ahead. And from that point of view, he said, well, someone would have done this. If not me, then someone would have done this. So I might as well do it. We do know that he felt at times sort of attacked. He was described as a merchant of death in a French magazine when they had mistakenly published his obituary when his brother had passed away. But he didn't truly feel that he was to blame in this. We can see his sort of cynicism a bit if we look on one of the earliest drafts for the Nobel Peace Prize. There he writes that to a friend again, he's thinking about creating a prize in peace. And he says, I want the award for peace awarded once every 5 years. No more than 6 times in total, he writes then. Because, he says, if they haven't solved it in 30 years, there is no solution. So that's the voice of a rather cynic person who doesn't, he wants peace, but he doesn't maybe believe in it. So I think we can understand the Peace Prize in particular, but also the other prizes as sort of a sense of hope, of idealism, of belief in the Enlightenment and of humanity's possibility to improve, to work, as he writes in the will, for the benefit for humankind. So to answer, it's not necessarily guilt, but there is some nuance there of hope, perhaps.
Could you tell us something about why the Peace Prize is given in Oslo?
Again, same with mathematics, because Nobel said so. That's unfortunately the answer for almost all questions that we have. Either because Nobel says so, or because the bylaw says so. Sweden and Norway were in many ways the same country at this point in time. Norway was independent but not sovereign. So the king of Sweden was the king of Norway. And we do know that Alfred Nobel highly approved of the peace work that was being done by the Norwegian parliament. They were, simply put, better at peace than Sweden was. So it's likely that he simply, in the same way that he picks the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, he wants the ones that are best in physics and chemistry, that's them. Continuing for other fields, and then peace ends up rather naturally in Norway. He never writes anything of this down, so this is to some degree conjecture with what we know of Nobel. Yes?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I was thinking, so when the Royal Academy and the committee, when you decide who the winner is going to be, do you follow up what this person might been saying? You know, nowadays that we live in this global world with the Instagram and maybe the Twitter. If these people, has it happened that some someone who got it, or you're thinking about a nominee. Has it happened that someone maybe posts something that is controversial or problematic? Would that in some way, and with controversial, then I mean some maybe comment like problematic in the racism, for example. Would that make affect, exactly, I'm thinking in Swedish, sorry, but yeah, would that affect your decision? Would you take that into account? And if it has not happened, if it happens, would it affect?
Well, since social media have been with us less than 50 years, there's very little we can say about it because all candidates are sort of secret. But of course, I mean, the committee is made of humans, and they read things and so on, and make up their minds. Who knows how. So from that point of view, I think it wouldn't be beneficial, at least, to write some racist slugs in social media, for instance. But it's nothing that in the bylaws, and of course, and really, I mean, one should, if somebody makes a great invention, and they happen to be a horrible person, that would be a real problem for the committee, I would say.
So going back more than 50 years, where we can talk about things, there was a prize in chemistry actually given to Fritz Haber in Germany after the Second World War, after the First World War.
First World War.
Yeah, and he had invented mustard gas during the war. So he had. That's not why he got the prize, but obviously he had caused the deaths of huge numbers of people during the war. But he was awarded because he was one of the inventors of the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen from the air and making fertilizers, which of course had enormously good effects, right? So that, I don't know about the history, the deliberations in the committee. Maybe you do, but
I haven't studied that particular case. But I think with Haber we can say that, on balance, he's probably saved billions of lives, World War I notwithstanding. Last thing I read on that was that around 50% of the nitrogen in our bodies comes eventually from the Haber-Bosch process. So they are hugely influential. But it's important to note, as you say, being great at science or making a great discovery or invention of improvement does not necessarily mean that you're a nice person. We have some truly awful people in the history of the Nobel Prize. Pedophiles, Nazis, racists, not plenty, but there are definitely such cases. And as you stated, what is to be taken into account is the discovery, the invention, the improvement, and not necessarily whether someone is a nice person or not. I would imagine there are limits to this.
And of course, in some cases, wasn't known at the time.
No.
And it may have happened later also. But obviously, laureates do get themselves into trouble now and then, right?
Just a final comment, since this is an international group of people, that this statement of Nobel that the prize should be given to the worthiest, irrespective if the person is Scandinavian or not. That was kind of controversial at the time. The king thought this was such a crazy idea. We Scandinavians are of course much better than others, so he refused actually to receive the prize. And to take part in delivering the prize took some time. And now of course, fortunately, all the royalties think this is a great event and so on. But it was really a very progressive idea that everybody is equal, should have equal chance of receiving a prize if one makes a discovery or invention in physics, for instance.
Thank you very much. To end off, we can say that the Nobel Prize, as you mentioned, is really the first international award. And it is through the work of the Royal Academy of Sciences and the Karolinska Institute and the other awarding institutions that has really established it as the benchmark for awards in the world today. Thank you very much, Gunnar and Lars.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk on the Nobel Prize and how you work. So please, this is for you, Gunnar, a bag for you, and a bag for you, Lars, and as well for you. Thank you so much. And as you see, there will be a busy week happening in December, and we're very proud that the Nobel Lectures, of course, 3 of them take place in Aula Magna at Stockholm University, and they are open and free to join, but they can be very crowded, so you have to stay in line. And then we have next week as well Nobel calling activities here in Studenthuset, and we're live streaming the announcements of the chemistry and the physics prize here in Studenthuset.